Welcome to another episode of Meet the Music. I'm your host, Thomas Corley. We have a guest for this episode from Montreal, Canada, Chris Maskell. Chris is a saxophonist, an educator, and a writer. Chris attended the Schulich School of Music of Maskell University, where he completed his Master of Music in Jazz Performance. Chris has extensive performing experience, having appeared in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa with his own groups. As a leader or sideman, he's played the Ottawa Jazz Festival, the Montreal Jazz Festival, which we'll kind of touch on today, the Toronto Undergraduate Jazz Festival, and Merrickville's Jazz Festival and the Ottawa Blues Fest. We discovered Chris on the internet. He wrote an article for the CBC Music, 40 Facts About Montreal International Jazz Festival on its 40th anniversary. We may not go through all 40. We may touch on a couple, and I'll share my favorite. But today we're going to just talk on, our thoughts on jazz today, cover traditional and contemporary jazz, talk about contextual, the blurring lines of genres. Ask Chris about his personal experience at the Montreal Jazz Festival, and then maybe share some thoughts on how we or the show and others can grow the audience listeners for jazz. Chris, welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I guess let's start not so far to the beginning, but why jazz?
Interestingly, I've actually always loved jazz from a young age. I actually started playing saxophone when I was in elementary school, mandatory music program. And my teacher at the time suggested that I check out some saxophone players, which is something I now recommend to my students who are just starting. You have to hear the sounds to get better at the instrument, sort of thing. And then I don't know how it happened exactly. It was so long ago, but I basically happened across these CDs of saxophonist Charlie Parker. And I didn't know anything about Charlie Parker at the time. I was just probably had Googled famous saxophone player or something. And he came up and I listened to it and I was immediately captured by the music. And it was also interesting to me. At that point, I was young enough. This was in 5th grade. I was young enough that I wasn't really super into other pop music. I just wasn't really listening to a lot of music at that point, maybe due to my age or whatever. But as soon as I heard Charlie Parker, I was immediately hooked. And I just kind of used that as a jumping off point to find other saxophonists. Like another one I fell in love with at that time was saxophonist Stan Getz. I found Dexter Gordon, found John Coltrane, although at that point I wasn't as deep into him as I am now. But I kind of started from there. And then through Charlie Parker and his associates in that time period, I kind of grew outwards in both directions, backwards. And I started listening to music that caught me up to present day. Because, Charlie Parker was active in the 40s and 50s, so quite a long time ago. But there was something about the improvisation and just to me, I just found it so enthralling and I love listening to it. So, and ever since then, I've listened to jazz and I've loved jazz. I listen to more different kinds of music now, but back in the day, I basically only listened to jazz. And as I got older, my horizons broadened a bit, but yeah, it sort of found me and I have loved it ever since.
Great. So you made mention of some great artists there, but in between the time that you were listening, because for myself, my discovery was not per se Miles or John Coltrane or Sonny Rollins. Mm-hmm. I kind of discovered it from the radio station that was playing the local. I don't know if it was considered smooth jazz yet at that time. I don't, because I'm a kid of the 70s, but so right. So they were introducing artists who weren't technically classified as jazz. In particular, Gino Vanelli. Mm-hmm. He was I don't know, soft rock maybe, or they called it blue eye soul, but he was being played on a jazz station here in Detroit. So his music, Michael Franks, Jean Luponte, Al Jarreau, and that kind of got me going, and then after that, like you said, once I got hooked that way, then I was introduced, or finding myself listening to Herbie Hancock, and you know and Miles Davis, and other artists of that nature, and then some, Quincy Jones. In fact, I would have to say it would go back. My introduction to jazz might have gone back to Charlie Brown, Vince Guaraldi,
Of
playing.
course.
Yeah,
Yep.
that tune got me hooked, and I was like, I love this, and I want more of it. So that's kind of where I was at.
Yeah,
So,
actually, I also listened to that when I was younger too, come to think of it. It's classic. I mean,
yeah, you get hooked.
you can't beat it.
Yeah. So today, jazz today,
Hmm.
um, with the sampling of um, uh, hip hop artists, like the Tribe Called Quest. They have a lot of jazz influence in their music.
Of course.
Kendrick Lamar today, or
Yep.
maybe
Pimp a
a few years
Butterfly, yeah.
ago, and then you have artists like Robert Glasper. Now, oddly enough, he was on Blue Note record label, but he got a Grammy for an R&B for that
Yep.
album he has.
Yep.
So what's your thoughts on jazz today?
If I look back, admittedly, I'm no historian, but if I look back and consider the tradition of jazz, even if we're thinking about a musician like Charlie Parker, he was an innovator. He and others around him, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, started playing a musical language that we now refer back to as bebop. And that was an innovation based on the music that was played before. And I think all these artists are influenced by what's happening around them. Jazz is an expression of what's going on in the world and in the artists' lives. Uh, so throughout history, throughout the last 100 years, you can look back and there's always jazz musicians, key jazz musicians releasing these seminal albums that are pushing the music in different directions and kind of broadening its horizons. So people like Herbie Hancock, you had mentioned, had done that. He had released these records called Rocket. He had done stuff like the Headhunters. Miles Davis puts out stuff like Bitches Brew, and they start going into more fusion direction. So there's been this kind of history of bringing jazz in these new directions. So when I consider jazz today, to me, it's just a logical extension of the kind of history that artists have had before this doing this. And if we even look at today, like obviously Herbie Hancock, one of the greatest jazz artists of all time, has given this his blessing because he plays on these recordings. I'm drawing a blank on whose it is, but yeah. Well, for example, yeah, Herbie Hancock now is apparently recording a record with Kendrick Lamar, Thundercat, Flying the Lotus, like these artists. So, and I've seen online there's videos that artists post of Herbie playing on their recordings and stuff. So he's still pushing it forward, and he obviously believes that this is a direction of the future. So, and he's given it his blessing in that way. So, to me, jazz today makes a lot of sense given the music in popular culture. Artists are integrating that and bringing improvising elements into that. So, yeah, to me, it's just a logical progression in a way.
Yeah. So that kind of leads to my next question in regards to the blurring of the lines of jazz. I guess the question is, what do you think on that tip as far as these super groups? Kamasi and Terrence Martin on a project, and Robert Glasper on a project together. So they're creating music together.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking about super groups, like artists are always checking out what other people are doing and getting inspired by it, and they want to collaborate. So they bring that stuff together, and I'm sure it's artistically stimulating for these artists to be put in these positions. Like the musicians who worked on Kendrick Lamar's record "To Pimp a Butterfly," I've listened to that so many times, and I'm just blown away every time because it's some of those tracks. It's just like an amazing marriage between the two, and it works so well. And I can only imagine being in the studio when that was happening. And another example I think of is David Bowie's final album, Black Star. Everybody else on that record is actually like, I mean, as far as I remember, everyone else on that record is a very like eminent modern jazz musician. So, and the music sounds amazing.
Yeah.
David Bowie likely, I would assume, tapped on these specific people because he wanted them to bring their musical personality to the room and to the recording. So there was some blurred lines there. Is it jazz in the purest sense? Arguably, probably not. But on the other hand, does it matter? I don't
Yeah.
think so. It just is
Yeah.
great music.
Yeah.
So that's how I think about it. Is,
Yeah.
I think it's a logical progression. The music is moving forward. These artists are exploring different directions. They have the largest respect for the tradition. They're not casting anything aside, but they're just kind of looking forward and saying, what can we do next? And again, just to go back to the example of Herbie Hancock or Miles Davis, two of the greatest that ever were, and in Herbie's case, it still are. If you look at their discography, the music they were playing changed so dramatically from their first record to what they release now. So these people are always looking for a different way to express themselves musically and otherwise. So the blurred lines thing kind of goes hand in hand with that. They're checking out, from my perspective, they're checking out what's going on the scene, getting inspired by it. They want to work in those kind of projects. And it's kind of that like culture of that musician culture of working with each other.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, I'm not a musician, so I can only go by what people tell me and what I read. But I hear or read and hear is that you guys, musicians, you don't like the box. You don't like the categorization of your genres. Because I saw a documentary, and it was a Quincy Jones documentary, and Duke Ellington and him were having I don't know if it was a conversation, but it was like a passing by of a conversation. And Duke says to Quincy, or says to people that were standing around, he said, there's a guy who's going to decategorize music, and I took that and, kind of held on to it because that's the way I feel. I mean, not being a musician, but I feel like music is music, it's all connected. And so I don't know. So that goes to the thing that I was led up to in the outline from the beginning of the show, is that contextualization of jazz now, where you have, or at least when you go to Google you go to the web and you Google jazz, not only do you get, Miles Davis's name and Herbie Hancock's name, but you get these videos of contextualized playlist. And those playlists have, I don't know, weekend jazz or after work jazz or whiskey jazz. So I just think it's another form of, and they have millions and millions of views, like tens of millions of views of people just listening to them. So, but here's the thing. Some of those videos don't have a playlist, below with the YouTube. So, I feel like the artist or the creator doesn't get the opportunity to get known. So a person can't, dig further, or is like the term I like to use, to go down the rabbit hole once they hear something. So I don't know. So what do you think about contextualization of a playlist like Spotify does?
Yeah. So I will say, full disclosure, I do use Spotify, but I'm going to follow that by saying that I don't think Spotify is a good thing for artists necessarily. Like, they do not really benefit from this. And, everybody I see in my circles is posting like jokes, basically, that they've received a check from Spotify for like $1 or something like that. And like, that's the extent of what they get from it. It's a really good product for the consumer. Like, I use it. It's a no-brainer. But if I try to support the artists in other ways. If there's someone whose music I really want, I'll make sure I purchase their record on Bandcamp or some platform that they get a larger percentage of the money. But yeah, there's also the unfortunate thing of, on these YouTube playlists, like you said, if there's not proper accreditation, no one, it's just like people, it's like it's just passing in the wind, like no one is going to know, like, oh, this was Chris playing on this song, or this is his song. It's just like part of a larger thing. There are some that are much better with that, but like you said, these big playlists are not always the best ways to discover music if it's not accredited well.
Right.
If we're talking about the contextualization of jazz in these playlists, like let's say it's like rainy day jazz or something like that,
Right. Right.
I think that kind of thing comes down to the individual, because I have thought about this before. And, when I listen to some of these things, because I do use some of these things to try to discover new music. And for me, it's like I get stuck in my rotation of what I listen to and I want to break out of that. So Spotify is a good tool because it thinks it has its algorithms that it suggests music for you. And it's like, oh, he must like this as well. So I use those things. But if we're talking about like actual rainy day jazz playlists or whatever, some of the music on there just simply doesn't strike me as rainy day music, but it might strike somebody else as rainy day music. But so that I think is totally up to the individual, and it's kind of just like, I don't know, take it or leave it, but it is what
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah. You know what? I guess I have to agree with you on that because I haven't thought about it that way because it is opinionated when you put a list together.
Totally. And I will also say though that I have music that like some songs I listen to when I think of the fall, for example, like the season, like autumn. I think of for some reason there's just like a certain something about it, a certain je ne sais quoi that makes me think of autumn. Maybe it's the harmony, maybe it's how the melody is a bit melancholy or something. And I do get images in my head of fall. So if I was to put all that music together in a playlist, I could say like autumn jazz or something like
Right.
that.
Right.
But
Yeah.
that's all personal. That's just like
Yeah.
my reaction. Or maybe in my past I've listened to this on a walk in the fall and there's some like subconscious thing connected there. I don't know, but all I want to say about that is I think it's really individual, and to me it's difficult to say like, this is definitively a Sunday afternoon song. It's like I don't know if you could say that. But that being said, if that's a good way for people to get the music packaged together and present it to them, I have no complaints, other than the artists don't really get any
Yeah.
money, which is a major complaint. But in terms of
Right.
music discovery, I think those things can be a good tool, because the music that Spotify or the YouTube uploader picks are usually good. Because sometimes you run out of music from the word of mouth method and you just want to try to find stuff. I think that's just the reality, the very unfortunate reality, I'll say, that we live in terms of what recorded music gives artists.
Yeah. So that leads me from going from recorded music to live performances.
Mm-hmm.
So in your uh, preference, I guess you say not necessarily experience, but your preference of playing live, auditorium, festivals, small clubs. I mean, I guess for me, it's the whole package for me. I love it all, whether it's intimate or auditorium or festival. I'm crazy about it. But as an artist, how do you feel? You like the intimacy? Is
For
it
me,
because that more considered a jazz thing that it has to be intimate and smoky?
it definitely doesn't hurt. But for me, I would say it depends on what music I'm playing. Because as a musician, certain scenarios lend itself better to certain results, I guess. If you're playing like some super high energy, like funk band or something like that, I would say you're going to feel even more at home on a big stage when there's a big audience feeding you energy. And I've done a few gigs like that. For example, that Blues Fest one that you mentioned in the intro, it was this R&B band, and I was just part of the horn section for that. I was playing alto in that group, and yeah, it was for a huge audience, and they were dancing, and you were getting a lot of energy. So that kind of band, I think, is a no-brainer that wouldn't make as much sense in a jazz club. Everyone's sitting down. It's just not a good match. But my main thing for playing jazz at a festival depends usually on the stage setup and the sound, because jazz is a very communicative music. It's a very communal music. If you're talking about like relatively, we can say relatively standard quote unquote jazz, you're playing if you're talking about a small group thing like a quartet or quintet, the musicians are communicating to each other musically. So the setup kind of has to facilitate that. If the sound is terrible, you can't hear the bass player, or you can't make out what he's playing. You can barely see the piano player all the way across the stage because the piano's at a weird angle, and you can't really hear them through your monitor speaker that you have in front of you. It's not going to be your best performance. And it was something that I've had to practice over the years, is working in those situations where you part of your mind is going like, gee, this is a bummer because the band is not sounding its best just because of how we're like the nature of the gig kind of thing. Whereas if you're playing in a small club, amplification is usually not needed for most instruments, maybe piano and bass, the horn or whatever usually doesn't have to be amplified. So that kind of thing is great because you're very close together on the stage. You can see there's good sight lines. You can hear everyone very clearly. And that usually, just because of the nature of the beast, lends itself to playing better. I'll also follow that up with saying that that's just a big generalization. But if I'm comparing like a big stage with bad sound to, chances are the jazz club is going to have good sound no matter what, unless you're really messing something up. It's like, it's going to be great. But, there is something about playing for an audience that's engaged and enthusiastic. And if in either setting, you can get that. But yeah, if we're talking traditional small group, jazz club is, as a performer, one of my favorite ways to play, and also as a listener. Also, coincidentally, just because of the sound.
Yeah.
Usually, some outdoor. I'll caveat that with it depends on where you're going, but like some outdoor festivals that I've been to, I can't hear the piano at all. Can't hear the sax. Let's say it's like, they're doing something, but you're so far away and they're not amplified right. It's like I literally can't hear because the bass and drums are so loud. It's like so it's a real bummer because I've seen some good artists that through no fault of their own, it wasn't my favorite concert just because I couldn't hear it. Whereas like if you're going to a jazz club, 95% of the time it's going to be excellent acoustically. Right. So yeah, that's what I would say. There's not one ultimate answer, but generally that's what I find.
So, what's your list of jazz type festivals you've been to?
I've been to. I grew up in Ottawa, and the one I would say I have been to the most, probably, I think this year actually is the first time this past summer because it was canceled actually because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I've been every year for like 12 or 13 years to the Ottawa Jazz Festival since I was younger, and then I've just been going ever since. So that's the one I've been to the most, just because that's where I'm from. But I've also been several times, probably since 2014 or 13, probably to the Montreal Jazz Fest. I try to go every year to see if there's always artists that interest me, free shows and paid shows. I've been to the Toronto Jazz Festival, which is also great. And yeah, I actually don't think I've been to any other jazz festivals yet, other than those ones.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are kind of within my immediate radius that are easy to get to.
Yeah, I have never been to the Montreal Jazz Festival. I was a family trip when I was 16. We went up to Montreal for the first time, and I haven't been back. But I've gone to Toronto a lot.
Great.
But
yeah.
So you haven't made it down to the Detroit Jazz Festival yet?
No, and also like Newport, I've never been. All these things that are on the bucket list, I really want to go. And like, New York also has its Winter Jazz Festival that it presents, and I always look at that in envy. I was in New York in January and caught some good music, but wasn't part of the Jazz Fest. But
right.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing that at some point.
Yeah, I actually getting some built up tension here for myself because I'm ready to explode for activities once we get out of this pandemic.
Totally.
And Montreal Jazz Festival is on my list, and the North Sea Jazz Festival in Netherlands is on my list.
That's awesome.
And so that's a start. And then of course, we talked offline, but got to make it to a Zydeco festival.
I've never been to one, but I'm sure it's great.
Yeah, yeah. So it's funny though how uh, I guess as a listener or kind of from a non-musician person, you kind of associate instruments, certain instruments, with particular genres of music, and like the
Hmm.
saxophone, and then the accordion and a rub board for Zydeco. It's just I just thought that was in my research and starting this journey, I kind of discovered that, and I was kind of surprised by that little that little tidbit. So, and your performances at the jazz festivals, uh, what artists were you able to meet and possibly perform with?
So at all those jazz festivals, I've actually only performed with my own group, which is great colleagues from Montreal, all about my age and all people that I went to McGill with. That's kind of where a big connecting point of the Montreal jazz community. So that at those festivals, it was just all my own band playing my own music. But yeah, I did participate actually. I'm remembering now. I was part of this program called the Ottawa Jazz Festival Youth Summit. This was probably 5 years ago or 4 years ago that I was a part of this. And basically, people from across Canada, artists from across Canada, apply to be part of this. I guess you could call it like a cross Canada supergroup, with lack of a better word. And you audition, and when you get accepted, you're all brought together from across the country to Ottawa, and they put you up in a nice hotel, and you play your own music for a week, and they put you up and everything. And everyone has to write music beforehand for the band. They tell you who's going to be there, the instrumentation. And through this program, we actually had a great opportunity to every day, the program director brought in different artists who was playing at the jazz festival to talk with us, and we played for them, and they would give us feedback. We played with them, and they would give us feedback. So a really memorable moment I remember was when we played with drummer Jim Black. He's from New York, fantastic drummer, and he was playing with us in one of these rehearsals, and it was just incredible. And it was such a good feeling of playing with this person. And yeah, that was a really good memory I had in that Ottawa Jazz Fest situation. It was a fantastic week. I mean, I think the program is still running. So if anyone in Canada is listening, definitely apply to that, because yeah, it's a great program. Definitely a highlight of my musical life so far. Meeting all these people and playing that music.
Oh, great. So, what for somebody who's interested in going to the Montreal Jazz Festival?
Mhm.
What's the whole experience like? I mean, is it cover? It covers 10 days. Is that correct?
Something like that. Yeah, I can't say with absolute certainty, but yeah, it's a week and a bit, and I would say it stands out on a global level for being one of the best, and it is touted as the best jazz festival. I don't know if that I can't speak to that with certainty, but uh, it's called the best because it has an incredible mix of free programming, and it's not just like small scale artists we're talking about here. They present some amazing concerts for free, and there's halls all over the city that present also paid programming indoors. This wide variety. Outdoors, there's probably 4 or 5 stages. You can walk around in this area in downtown Montreal called Place des Arts. There's a bunch of different stages of different sizes that are presenting music. Probably, I would say, 10 or 12 hours a day for 10 days. And you can walk around, and it's all that stuff outside is free. So you can just walk around, and you end up at a stage, and you're checking something out, and you see your friend there who you haven't seen in a while. And then it's a great social opportunity, and it brings together millions of people over the course of these days, because it's in a really prominent place downtown. Um, and yeah, and indoors, there's a bunch of fantastic concert halls across the city that also present this music, and they get some of the most prominent jazz artists in the world to come and play. So every year, it's an opportunity in Montreal to catch some of the most happening jazz out there, and they always book up and coming stuff and important artists that you really want to see. So it's the perfect balance between this like free programming that you're exploring and you know you're getting into, and then you have those other shows that you're like, oh, I've got to make sure I get a ticket to this because this is going to be incredible. So that's the experience. You know, it's really fantastic.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for sharing that because I know that people who are interested in the jazz world, I know live performances is probably the best way to experience it. I mean, I'm not knocking vinyl or anything like that, but you get the whole, experience live.
For sure, you're
Jazz is
there.
one of those things. Yeah.
You're there in person and you're seeing the music happen in front of you, but the musicians, speaking from a musician's perspective, you also benefit from playing live because there's a certain energy that is, at least for someone of my stature, difficult to replicate when playing in the studio. Especially if you're in a studio where everyone is isolated in their own little booths and all you can hear is over your headphones the rest of the band. You know, you can still make great music, but when you have the group together on the stage playing live, there's some of my favorite recordings are live recordings of jazz groups because there's something that comes out in the group dynamic, the energy, the improvisation that there's fantastic recordings from these same groups in studio, but some of the stuff that comes out live is amazing. And artists sometimes take a greater liberty to stretch out and improvise longer solos and be a bit more free in a live setting too. So there's that added element where they're not so much concerned about constructing a live record or something and worrying about minutes or anything like that. They're like, well, we have this long of a concert. We're just going to play these tunes. And if something happens kind of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think live is the best way to experience jazz if you can.
Right. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Your improvisation, do you find yourself changing up every time, or you've got your little niche that you do?
I think, well, for myself, I'm no master by any means. So, yeah, I definitely have things that I fall back on. And I kind of think of it like speaking English, for example. You're not going to say the same sentences in the same way every single time you talk about a subject, let's say. So, in this case, the subject would be a specific song. We're playing a song. If I'm playing this song, I'm not going to say the exact same things in the exact same way every time, but chances are there's going to be things that come out that are similar between solo to solo because that's like the language that you've built internally, and that's kind of you're improvising what you hear. Ideally, in an ideal world, that's what you're doing, and that's what everyone strives to do. Is just improvise what they hear. So once you get that kind of language built up, you're hearing similar things, and you have to make sometimes as I have found, at least when I'm studying music and trying to broaden my musical vocabulary, you have to purposely try to work on hearing new things so that it comes out in your improvisation. And actually, it's really interesting. You can see prime examples of this in solos of the masters as well. You know, like if we're just talking about Charlie Parker, he was an incredible innovator, but he also had things that he would play that are, you can look from solo to solo and you can say, oh, there's that again. And that by no means is a knock against him. What he played was amazing, but he had built up a personal language, and that personal language he was hearing it, and that's what he was improvising. So, and another example is I had done a study recently, for whatever reason, of talking about going down a YouTube rabbit hole. Is saxophonist Michael Brecker had this band in the 80s with the guitarist Mike Stern, and I really loved this tune that they were playing called Upside Downside. And on YouTube, for whatever reason, there's a lot of recordings from this same tour of them playing in different cities, maybe not the same tour, but in the same range of years, the same few years. And you can find a bunch of videos of this band playing in different cities and different concerts. And I loved the first solo I heard of Michael Brecker playing on this song. So I started hunting out different versions, and 2 or 3 that I found start in almost the same way. It wasn't exactly the same. Michael Brecker changed it up from time to time, but he had a very similar approach, and that really struck me. That it was like the first solo, I was like, wow, this is incredible. And of course, it is still incredible, but you can see that Michael Brecker had this concept and this approach to at least in this time of his life, how to approach this song. And you can see that in these different concerts. Wasn't verbatim, but it was very similar. So I think that kind of stuff is really interesting as an improviser. You know, people are always creating new stuff all the time, but usually there's these nuggets that reoccur in everyone's language. And that's what makes these great improvisers identifiable in some ways. You know, you can hear somebody and you can say, oh, that's this person, because they have their own sound, they have their own way of phrasing, but they also have stuff that comes out and they're playing repeatedly. And you're like, oh, you can even say like, oh, that person got this from this person. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lineage you can trace back. So long answer to that question, but yeah, there's definitely things that come up, some of which I definitely wish didn't come back when I played. But then there's others that I've just learned to accept at this point. I don't fight against it too much because, you know, in 5 years, it'll be something different as I continue to evolve.
Yeah. No, I thank you for sharing that, because I mean, I actually read that, and I think I remember coming across that a couple of times, how musicians reference that as a language, you know, as you know, and so yeah, I thank you for putting that out there for us. So, so you have I asked you to do a list of artists, and you can, you know, run through the list, but I have a particular question for you on one.
Sure.
One selection. So, I mean, you've got the traditional ones, I guess you could say, you know, Miles
Yeah.
Davis and so on. But why? Well, go ahead and go through your list, and then I'll ask you my question.
Okay, so when Thomas had reached out to me, he suggested that I provide 5 picks, but he made the big mistake of also saying that I could select 5 more if I wanted to. So the approach that I took to this is I was having real difficulty narrowing it down to 5. So I broke it up into 5 what I called all-time classics versus a complimentary list of what I would call 5 new classics. So
By the way, I like the way you did that.
because I think for a new listener, it's important. Jazz has existed for so long at this point. Well, relative to other kinds of music, not so long. It's still very young, but you know, 100 odd years of jazz, let's say, give or take. So over the course of that time, there's some albums that are just irrefutably like have impacted the music on a really large scale. So I had said Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, Sonny Rollins, The Bridge, Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage, Count Basie Orchestra record called The Atomic Mr. Basie, and Billie Holiday's Lady Sings the Blues. I selected these with a few things in mind. I wanted to try to balance. I wanted to come from it from the perspective of somebody who had never listened to jazz before. Where would you start? And these 5 records are not by any means the only important 5 you should know, but they will give you a relatively good overview of some different things that were happening. You know, Kind of Blue is probably the most famous jazz album of all time. Everyone, I would say, who is into music to a certain extent probably has heard some mention of Kind of Blue. Sonny Rollins, The Bridge. Sonny Rollins is a super important improviser in the history of jazz, and The Bridge was a record that he recorded after he came back from a sabbatical of a few years, or actually don't remember how long, but a relatively long sabbatical in jazz terms, where he reportedly practiced on a bridge day in and day out. That was his practice space, on a bridge in New York. So he came back with this album, The Bridge, and his musical expression and his improvising is unbelievable to this day. Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage. This was recorded, I believe, in the 1960s. Let me fact check myself before I make a fool of myself. Let's see. Yeah, so mid 1960s, he recorded Maiden Voyage. And, you know, there's some great musicians on here. Herbie is maturing as an artist. He's a super important jazz musician. You've heard me mention him several times so far. So, you know, that's a record you could use to start checking him out. I also wanted to include some big band music in there, because that's one thing actually I haven't talked about a lot yet, is the jazz orchestra, or the big band is really important to jazz history. you had like Duke Ellington was mentioned in this conversation. He had a fantastic jazz orchestra. Count Basie over many, many years had a fantastic jazz orchestra. There was also, people like Benny Goodman in the swing era who were very important. And, this has evolved into modern day. And I also selected a album in my new classics list that is a modern jazz orchestra. And it's really interesting to see how that has evolved over time. But this Count Basie record is really stand out because it's super swinging. It's the band at some of its best. It's a all-time classic. And then I also there's an important thing that we also haven't talked about yet, which is, the tradition of vocals in jazz and singers is extremely important. And one of the biggest, the greatest and most influential jazz singers of all time is Billie Holiday. That's like a household name, So her record, Lady Sings the Blues, has some of her most important recordings on it, and it's just a great way to kind of get into her side of music. And there's other fantastic classic jazz singers like Sarah Vaughan or Ella Fitzgerald, and there's a whole tradition, and it's super important. So looking at that list of five, it's by no means comprehensive. I had to purposely omit including something from John Coltrane, my favorite artist of all time. But I was trying to think of a beginner, or so to speak, beginners or a newcomer's way.
I love that, and I appreciate that, because that's exactly what I was thinking when I asked the question. So you kind of gave me insight on why, or at least an answer to my question of Billie Holiday.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's why she's on the list, because you were thinking from a perspective for a new listener to
Mm-hmm.
introduce them to a vocalist.
Yeah, I think for somebody getting into jazz, you don't have to listen to all, you could, I guess, for lack of a better word, call them subgenres in a general speak. But it's important to be familiar with the fact that there was these different things happening in jazz throughout the history. There's small group jazz, which I've referenced a lot because that's primarily what I play. Quartets, quintets, extremely important. But there's also there's jazz orchestra is really important to the history. Vocalists are really important to the history. So, and there's different movements, like Kind of Blue is more what you would call modal jazz, so to speak, in the 1960s. So that was really important. Somebody like Sonny Rollins on the Bridge is not playing modal jazz. It's something completely different. Herbie Hancock, that record is also a bit modal. So yeah, there's all these different things going on. And I think when you start listening to jazz, you can get overwhelmed in a way because you can put something on and you'll go like, ugh, I hate jazz. Because you happen to cross something that is not in your taste. And it's easy for people sometimes to just get immediately turned off and said like, oh, I listened to this jazz recording and it made no sense and they're playing all the wrong notes. That famous like internet meme, like in jazz, like why don't they just play the right notes? So there's that thing. Like if you put on the wrong recording for yourself, something you don't like right off the bat, it's easy to get turned off. So there's a lot of going on in the history of jazz, and even today, stuff going on. So I would say if you listen to something and you don't like it, keep poking around and keep looking, because chances are there's going to be something maybe more traditional or more melodic. Like if you like more melodic stuff, you're going to find something like that in the jazz canon for sure. It's there.
Right.
It's important to know it's a big picture we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, and I think we dropped a lot of names of a lot of artists that somebody should be able to find something that they like out of
For
that,
sure.
out of the names that we mentioned. So you had the new classic list.
Yes. So this was, I thought, important to put in because these are records that I was reflecting and putting this list together earlier this week, and I was thinking, the all-time classics are stuff that has any artist, can point back and say like, yes, this was an important record in history and has probably influenced me. But these new classics are stuff that I would say musicians of my generation, I'm relatively young, were influential on us. And even, anybody in today, they listen to these records and you're influenced by them because the artist, it's musical artistry at such a high level that I would expect come, I don't know, 50, 60 years, people will look back and say like, these were the classics of, or some of the classics of the like early 2000s or mid, So I had said my first one was Esperanza Spalding's debut album, Esperanza. She is a fantastic bass player and singer. And she's incredibly talented to the point that she basically graduated the Berklee College of Music and was immediately hired to teach there. So
Wow.
that kind of gives you a over like a kind of sensationalist view of like the level of her talent. But that notwithstanding, she is very creative. She's very influential. And interestingly, if we're talking about artists who start at a certain point and go in a different direction, this record probably was released, I don't know, 2008, 2007, 6, something like that. And now in 2020, if you compare her music to then, completely, I would say completely different. It's still Esperanza at the core, but she's gone in a totally different direction that is really interesting. So she's another artist, you know, you can look back and she's totally evolved over time. But that first record was really influential to me. And I think it was really important. It kind of brought her onto the scene. It has this great version of the classic jazz standard Body and Soul, but she plays it in a different time signature and she sings it in her own way. You know, it's really interesting.
By the way, I want to mention and drop a hint here that I did listen to your version of Body of Soul on your website.
Thanks for checking it out. I think that one is pretty old at this point. I can't even remember. But yeah, thanks for checking that out. Another one I had on my list of new classics was Wynton Marsalis, who is also, I would say, a household name at this point. He rose to prominence, not being exactly sure of my dates here, but 80s, I would say, is when he kind of exploded on the scene. Maybe late 70s, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, he became super famous very quickly because he was incredibly talented at playing jazz trumpet, like jazz style trumpet, and also classical trumpet incredibly well, like world class tier in both genres, which is something that, as somebody who used to play classical saxophone back when I was younger, it's very difficult for one artist to be able to encompass both of these things to such a high level because you have to dedicate so much time to the performance practice and just getting all the nuances, and each thing has its own world of minute details you have to master. So to be able to get both of these things to such a high level is incredible. So Wynton exploded onto the scene at the beginning, playing a lot of classical music and jazz. He has recordings with orchestras that my dad showed me when I was a kid, and I loved it. It was like, wow, this is amazing. But he has since shifted it overall in a more jazz direction. And that recording that I put on the list, Standard Time Volume 1, is really interesting because it's his group playing a unique twist on a lot of classic jazz standards. There's a track on there, Cherokee. It's a really well-known jazz standard, usually played very fast, and they do play it very fast. And Wynton sails through it. He sounds incredible, just demonstrates absolute mastery of the instrument and improvisation. So that is a really important record. I had also mentioned earlier that I had included a recording from a modern jazz orchestra, and I think one of the most influential modern jazz orchestras is Maria Schneider's Jazz Orchestra. And this is one of her first recordings, if not the first, actually, I think. It's called Evanescence. And it has wonderful playing by a lot of today's biggest names are on that recording. And it's beautiful compositions and arrangements by Maria Schneider, and a lot of jazz composers and arrangers since then have been influenced by her. So she's already kind of casting her influence over the jazz scene, and is going to prove to be like one of the biggest, if somebody in 100 years looks back at jazz history, Maria Schneider is definitely going to stand out as a highlight in terms of mastery and influence. One of my favorite drummers is the drummer Brian Blade, who I've heard on live a bunch of occasions and I've loved it every time. And he has a really interesting band called the Fellowship Band. And the record I put on there is, again, one of the first, if not the first record by that group, and it's called Perceptual. And it's really interesting to me because, again, it has a lot of jazz's biggest names today are on that recording. It's an interesting format. It has alto sax, tenor sax, guitar, piano, bass, and drums, if I'm remembering correctly. And also on some tracks there's a slide guitar. If not all tracks have this slide guitar player on it. And it's really interesting because it brings almost like a more like folky aspect into the jazz, and people, compare his music. It's kind of like a folky jazz thing, but it's great. They have amazing improvisation. Everyone sounds fantastic on it. So, and since that came out in the early 2000s, that has proved to be one of the a really influential band in the past 20 odd years is Brian Blade's Fellowship Band. They continue to record and release music. And my last pick for this new classic was probably the most recent. Yes, it is the most recent one out of all of them. And it's Kamasi Washington's The Epic. And this came out pretty recently. So I remember very distinctly when it came out. And I heard it and I was just blown away by it. The title really sums up the feeling I got listening to the first track. It is truly epic.
Right.
And the first track is this epic tune that has this full choir singing in the background, and it's just like, it's huge. The feeling of listening to that for the first time was incredible. And since then, Kamasi Washington has been really influential. Like you had mentioned previously in this conversation about he's playing with all these different artists, and he's really like he's in that group of people who are pushing music, jazz and other music genres forward. He's really involved with that. He's a super important musician. So he, again, it was another person who exploded onto the scene. And I'm sure people will look back on him and in this era and say that he is one of the people who had cast a huge, huge influence over jazz in our modern time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I picked up on your new classic list. I picked up the 3 that I don't think I've ever listened to before.
Great.
Esperanza,
Which were those?
Esperanza.
Oh yeah.
Well, no, I've heard her, and I like her. I have that one, and of course Kamasi's. I've heard that one, but the other one, Winton's album, I don't think I've listened to. And the other 2 band orchestras.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I definitely will pick up on those myself and give them a dive.
Definitely do it. And again, my approach with this kind of stuff is with jazz, like in these smaller bands, at least, or even in these larger bands, I always find when I find a new recording, there's some person in there that kind of piques my interest. And then I start investigating them, and I say, like, for example, in Brian Blade's Fellowship Band is one of my favorite, well, probably my favorite guitarist and one of my favorite musicians of all time, Kurt Rosenwinkel. And that's a younger Kurt Rosenwinkel. So it's really interesting to hear him at a younger age. But, I would hear him on these recordings, and then I got really interested in his music and I started exploring all of his stuff. So, and he has his own huge stack of original albums, and they're all incredible. So it's really interesting. And like in Winton's band, he has some amazing musicians in there too. So you start finding these threads of like, oh, I really like this person. So now I check out this person's music, and it leads you to more people. And then it's kind of this web that you start exploring. And that's how I navigate jazz listening now at this point. But that being said, you need a way to get in. And kind of goes back to what I was saying, like, it can be daunting. And I think there's also like a mythos that's been built up around jazz being this like, difficult music to get into. And it's jazz musicians can be snobby, and there's like all this, you're very purist. And I would say that's misinformed. I think it's just like been kind of built up to be more than it has to be in terms of that. Because you can find a way, something you like for sure, I would say.
I think people are cheating themselves in life if they're mono musical.
I totally agree.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like, having a palate for different foods. I mean, for myself, I think that's the way it is. And hence why I kind of wanted to have something of this show, take that journey.
Yeah. And I'll say that from my perspective, like I had mentioned at the very beginning, that when I was younger, I basically only listened to jazz, and because that was really only that thing that interested me. And I was in a position where I was like, there's so much to listen to. And that just occupied my listening time. Was like, I was just trying to basically catch up. It's an impossible task, but I was just trying to like absorb as much as I could. And then, as years have gone on, I've checked out different stuff. And I think I can say with confidence that any genre I've listened to, I found something that I like. Like, I think it benefits the listener and the musician to keep an open mind, because in school, especially, my teachers would always tell me that like anything you do musically is going to benefit you. So just from a musician's perspective, the more stuff you're absorbing and the more new things you're hearing and getting exposed to, it's just there's nothing that can hurt you musically. It's not like you're going to get suddenly worse if you listen to like uh, musician X or something like that. Everything benefits you, and for the listener too. Like you said, you're cheating yourself if you're not exploring everything that you don't have to explore everything, but like to keep an open mind, get out there, listen to different stuff. You're going to have some great discoveries.
Yeah, and I think that's key, because that's kind of what that would guess that leads me to a closing kind of topic. By having an open mind, how does the industry, how does the world, get more listeners? I guess it's kind of the not that you and I can solve that problem today right now, but I mean, what's your thoughts on expanding the audience or the community, jazz community? Now keep in mind, I understand that the pipeline is being filled with musicians, but how do we get the seats filled?
That is the big question, isn't it? If we're just talking about jazz, I would say that these times, just with the rise of the internet and jazz education, more extremely high level musicians are being, I don't want to say pumped out, but are developing faster than at any time. Because even from a young age, if you're interested in learning, there's no secrets anymore, really. You just go on the internet and there's YouTube videos, tutorials breaking down how to play and breaking down all these topics, and the information you have at your fingertips is huge. So you're totally right that there's no lack of musicians at all. And yeah, the trick is the audience. And I think it's about trying to be an ambassador. Like in my perspective, one of the things I love the most about, being on shows like this, it's a great time, but it's also important to me to try to like share my love with the music with people, and try to help people know that jazz specifically is not some like walled off community, like
Right.
we want you to get involved, in fact. So, and I think there is that element, like I mentioned, of it's like, oh, it's very inaccessible and difficult to get into. But I would argue only if you're listening to more challenging music, shall we say, in the jazz canon. So, yeah, I think it's about the community making sure that they're reaching out to people and talking to people, and trying to involve their non-music friends. Like I've had some of my friends who love music discover they really like going to jazz shows. Let's say they have a blast when they go, and they didn't know they liked that. So it's just a matter of like trying to build that and work on that. And yeah, it's tough too, at least from the musician's perspective, because like I mentioned, like a lot of music consumption is done through platforms like Spotify and YouTube. So they're not really making any money through those ways. So the live performance is an important source of income, so if you can get the gigs. So that's something that's really important, is to try to keep that going. But it's nice that in Montreal, there are several jazz clubs that are invariably full on the weekends, because people just love going there to have dinner, or like, they want the experience of going. And it's really encouraging to me if I go to one of those, that see like it's, as long as it's like a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, something like that, not a random night in the middle of the week where people have worked the next day, let's say, it's full. People are there. People are loving it. They listen. They enjoy it. So it's nice that Montreal has those clubs for sure. And coming from Ottawa, there's definitely not something like that there. There's a definite lack of those kind of jazz experiences. So it's the big question of how to develop this audience for sure.
So let me ask you this question in regards to the whole jazz scene in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just mainly in the pocket of the East, Toronto? Is it, or the British Columbia area, the West Side? Or do you think it's a heavy jazz scene over there? Or?
From my perspective, of course, I'm sure there's great players across the whole country. But the scenes seem to be focused in a few principal areas that I would say are the hubs. being Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver are the three that would really jump out to me if I think about the country's greatest players. Where do they reside? Are likely in those. Of course, they're scattered across the whole country, but if we're looking at just like volume of where people have congregated, basically, that's
Yeah.
kind of what we're looking at. And
Okay.
uh, yeah, so that's smaller cities like Ottawa. There were some fantastic players too, but it's I always find it's beneficial to be in a scene where there's a lot of people because you're pushed as an individual because the ceiling is so much higher in terms of ability. So that's people kind of congregate in those three principal areas, at least in Canada.
Yeah. Because the thing that somewhat fascinates me is that as popular as football, American football is,
Hmm.
when they have the Super Bowl, you're looking at 100,000 people,
Hmm.
you know, but you may get 100 million viewers, across the world.
Right.
But like the city of Chicago, Detroit, or New Orleans, those festivals, are 300,000 400,000 people,
Hmm.
in that time frame. And so, and in Toronto, I mean, not Toronto, Montreal is known to have 2 million people over that 10-day spread.
Yep.
So, I mean, the popularity and I guess the appreciation for the genre is there. Is just that, like you said, I mean, the obvious thing is that it's just pockets,
Yep.
just pockets.
And I think also for those festivals, a big part of it is the festival experience. And that's what draws out people, like people who might not necessarily go extremely out of their way to go to a jazz club on a weekend, let's say, want to be part of that exclusivity of, oh, I went to the Jazz Fest this year, I was there. And I think that plays a lot into it. It could draw some potentially more casual listeners who still really enjoy jazz, but just won't go out of, like I said, out of their way. And it's great to see that bring the community together, and those people are hopefully exposed to new music and they hear new artists, and that gets them thinking about other stuff. And yeah, it's great.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's I think that's a good observation in regards to the casual listener shows up at those events.
Yeah, and it's great.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's I mean, I'll also say that jazz festivals these days probably don't present the most like pure lineup of jazz. even
Right. Yeah,
even like little blurring of the lines within the genre notwithstanding, I think it's you can conclusively say like these festivals, especially Montreal, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's bring the people out. And the way that I see it is, yes, it's not absolutely pure jazz fest, and some of these big outdoor shows are arguably not jazz at all. But it brings out the people. It gets it going, and it's fuel that the festival needs to keep going and presenting other shows that they might be taking a risk on a little bit more in terms of they're worried about, oh, can we sell out the hall or whatever. So I mean, they always, from my experience in Montreal, it's always full somehow. But yeah, it's important for them to have this diversity because it brings people out, and the more people enjoying music, the better, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah. I spoke with the president of the Detroit Jazz Festival, and that was one of the things when I asked him. We talked about the growing of the audiences.
Hmm.
He had made mention of having a grandparent bring a younger person to the concert.
Yep.
And that was his idea when they introduced Common at one of the Detroit Jazz Festival, and he performed with Riggins, Kenny Riggins. Is that his name? I'm drawing a blank on it. But that was the same time that Kamasi Washington was there,
Hmm.
so it was kind of like a jam session where the
Awesome.
grandfather wasn't familiar with Common,
Hmm.
but the grandson was, and so they kind of introduced each other to the artists.
Yeah,
So it was kind of that kind of thing that took place there. And so he was saying that that's why they kind of not purist jazz festivals in a sense, because they want to introduce people.
totally.
And one of the things he made mention also too was that reaching out to the Detroit area's Latino community, and introducing Latin jazz stage, and then he said he was having to bus them in. He knew transportation was probably might have been an issue, so he was setting up buses
Oh, that's
for
great.
for them to come into the area. So and then this past year, because like you said, because of COVID and the pandemic, they were able to go still have the concerts live inside of a hotel inside of the ballrooms, and
Oh, wow.
they were able to broadcast. And he got the numbers recently. Well, I read in the paper that the numbers were close to 1 million viewers
Wow.
for the 3 days of like you said, about 10 hours of performing each day.
That's
So
fantastic.
yeah,
Yeah, I've been seeing other jazz festivals are doing something similar. Like a lot of stuff is going digital, and I think given the circumstances, it's as good as we can get. So I'm all for it.
yeah, yeah. I read in the paper. Well, before I tell you what I read in the paper, I saw that in Baltimore, musicians were just, of course, doing the nice weather days. They were doing serenades on the street corner,
Hmm.
and they would take donations on the spot. And some of them said they made more money doing that than they did in the club. So
Yeah, that's
yeah.
the harsh reality sometimes. But yeah, actually, similar things are happening in Montreal. People, when it was warmer outside, because we are in Canada,
Hmm.
it was, people were going outside and playing together, and it was great. The community was just finding a way to make it work. But yeah, it's tough times, but we're going to come out on the other side of it for sure.
Yeah, it is. Well, I forgot my thought that I was talking about in the paper, but so are you on social media?
Yeah, not incredibly active these days, I have to say. But yeah, you can. I have a kind of Facebook page out there. If you just search Chris Maskell music, you can find it. On Instagram, you can find me at Maskell Chris, where I mostly actually these days just I'm an amateur photographer, so I'm mostly just getting my creativity out in our COVID times that way a lot. So I post photos there, and then yeah, and I also have my website chrismaskell.com. And I'll also just put a plug in there that I'm also working these days, just beginning to work with an organization in Montreal called the St. Henry Jazz Society. And we're going to be putting out some really cool stuff over the next foreseeable future. We're working a lot on different projects to celebrate the history of jazz in Montreal. And it's interesting that you mentioned getting in new listeners, because one of our objectives is actually to bring in people who are interested in jazz into jazz through some of our activities. So yeah, we'll be posting content there, and I'm going to be working with them to on that kind of stuff. So I'll just find their Instagram name because I don't know it off the top of my head. At St. Henry, Henri Jazz on Instagram. And you'll be connected to the other platforms from there. But yeah, we're going to be posting some interesting things about the Montreal jazz community there. So I think any jazz fan would be interested to see that, because there's going to be an historical aspect about it, but also, covering what's going on in this big Canadian jazz city.
All right, great. Thanks. So just one last thing. We mentioned the 40 list, and
Mm-hmm.
you and I were going to share. I'm going to share mine. Mine is number 40. uh, it's the reason number fact. The fact number 40 is it's not jazz fans who love, not only jazz fans who love the Montreal Jazz Festival, but the artists do too. And the artists that they mentioned, or that you mentioned in your writing, was the late Al Jarreau, the late Dave Brubeck, and Pat Metheny, or I should say Dr. Pat Metheny. McGill University gave him a doctorate.
Yeah, just like last year or 2 years ago, actually.
Yeah. And then Tony Bennett. So they say this is the best. They say that it's the world's best.
Yeah, I mean, I was really enthused to see that. And I'm just looking through my list here. And honestly, when I was researching this article, I was having a blast finding out all these little tidbits about the festival over the past years. And I had some idea of the history of it from my colleagues and mentors, but it was great to get more in depth. But what I always have found particularly entertaining is almost these like behind the scenes elements of jazz heroes. You know, like you have these people that you are jazz heroes and you look up to them, and then you find out these little stories that kind of make you laugh. So, two quick ones that I had here that I thought were really funny. In 1982, bassist Jaco Pastorius couldn't find guitarist Pat Metheny in their hotel, so he set off the fire alarm to smoke Metheny out of his room.
Oh, wow.
And another one that I thought was really funny was saxophonist John Zorn, really well-known saxophonist, once held up the start of a Plastisar concert for more than half an hour until he got a smoked meat sandwich from the famous Montreal Schwartz's Deli. And the festival probably was panicked, so they were just trying, like, they were like, oh man, this guy's just got to go out there, like he's just got to play. So they went for speed rather than quality, and they got him a sandwich from a different smoked meat shop. And apparently John Zorn somehow knew that and threw the sandwich against a wall. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, there's all these behind the scenes stuff that I found really interesting, and the John Zorn story I had actually heard as like a passing anecdote, but with these things, you're like, did this actually happen? But I was able to like get multiple sources from these books that I was looking at in Montreal jazz history that actually, yeah, it actually happened. So things like that I always find super funny because you hear these in the community kind of in passing, and it's like, oh, he actually threw it against the wall.
That's crazy. Yeah. Well, Chris Maskell, I appreciate your time. Thank you so, so much for
It was a
participating.
pleasure. I wish you all the best in the show. I think it's a really great initiative. It was a pleasure to talk.
Would you like to come back for any other genre?
I probably couldn't speak to anything as in depth as I can with jazz. Dedicated a lot of time to it, but I mean, yeah, if I can speak on something else, I would definitely be willing to chime in.
Well, we'll probably have you back when we get to the point where we're talking about different countries and their interpretation of jazz.
Cool. That sounds great.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, sir. Much
All right.
appreciated.
Take care. All the best.